Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. And this Saturday, it will be big time on CBS. That's right, renewing one of the best rivalries in the Big Ten. It is Minnesota at Iowa. And you can, of course, watch this on CBS, America's most watched network, the network of stars. You can stream it on Paramount Plus, a mountain of entertainment. Now, let's talk about the football before we get to the trophy, because these two teams are both riding high right now. Minnesota they're really bundled up Nebraska, packed them up, and sent them shipping with a good, strong win on last Friday night. Then Iowa follows it up with a close win, getting it done. A little bit of a nail-biter, but Kirk Ferentz ends up not having to pay for it. They beat Penn State. You celebrate a win against Penn State anytime you can. So vibes are great for both of these teams. Let's figure out how they got there. Tom, to your eye, what worked well for Minnesota in the win against Nebraska? How much of it was Minnesota? How much of it was Nebraska? And how do you think that could impact your expectations for this week?
I would go 50-50 as far as who was to blame for what happened last week or who was to take credit. I think that, Minnesota will start off with the fact that they had 9 sacks in the game against Nebraska, which is a very high number, but I would argue Dylan Raiola was responsible for at least half of those sacks. He kind of just ran into the pressure quite a few times and, allowed them to bring home. There were times where Minnesota was rushing 3 and Raiola would just step right into the oncoming defensive end and go down, which is not typically what you want to see. But they did slow down that Nebraska offense overall. Coverage-wise, there weren't many busts. They were able to dominate the game on the line of scrimmage and also be able to limit the explosive plays for Nebraska. And offensively, it was the same script that we've seen from Minnesota all season long. They are not especially good at anything. They've actually been better throwing the ball than they have been at running it, but they're not explosive in any key area. Really, Minnesota's offensive superpower is just the fact that they don't turn the ball over. So it's like they don't find themselves being put in spots where their defense has to deal with short fields. They win the game, the field position battle. They manage the game, and then they hope that they can make enough plays where they finish with more points than you do. In other words, they kind of look like a peak Iowa team from the heyday when the Hawkeyes were winning 10-9 games every single season, where they weren't spectacular, but they just weren't beating themselves. They were allowing the other team to beat themselves and taking advantage of it. And that's really what the Gophers are going to be trying to do here, to be going on the road to Iowa at Kinnick Stadium. You can't beat yourself. This is an Iowa team that is not good enough offensively probably to pull away from you. So as long as you don't make mistakes and take care of the football, you're going to give yourself a chance to win in the fourth quarter, and that's going to be Minnesota's approach.
So I love the matchup last week for Minnesota against Nebraska. I bet them, obviously, on our Cover 3 Locks podcast. And that's really because I thought Minnesota could do a decent enough job stopping Nebraska's run game and also get to Raiola without having to blitz. If you look at it, they had an awesome day in terms of limiting the Cornhuskers' explosive plays, and they did a pretty decent job against that Nebraska run game. This is a bit of a different test, though, because Nebraska is, I think, one of the worst offensive lines in the Big Ten. Iowa is unquestionably one of the best. So it's like completely reversed, right? Like this is going to be a real challenge for that Nebraska defensive line, for that Minnesota defensive line, which has been pushed around at times so far this year. Also, if you're Minnesota, you have got to find a way to score some points against Iowa. Since 2019, they've scored 19, 7, 22, 10, 12 in a win, and 14 points against Iowa. So for the most part, defensive coordinator Phil Parker has this PJ Fleck offense figured out pretty much regardless of who's calling the plays for Minnesota. As I know they've had a few offensive coordinators in that stretch. So I don't really know how they find a way to score enough. And I do think Iowa should be able to run the football effectively here on this Gopher defense.
Yeah, but I will go ahead and throw this right back to you first, because now I'm saying, all right, what is Iowa's plan here? Obviously, Mark Gronowski is going to be a big key of the run game as well as everything else. Do you see from this Iowa offense one that, look, they went and they put up 37 points on Wisconsin, and Wisconsin might not be anything close to the caliber of the logo on the side of the helmet, but you still had to go out there and you still had to score 37 points. They get into the mid-20s against Penn State, a Penn State defense that still has players that are going to be playing on Sundays. What has been working well for the Hawkeyes that you think can translate here?
I think they're starting to learn the quarterback Mark Gronowski's strengths. Which, honestly, like his legs have been a major weapon. He had that beautiful bootleg last week against Penn State. I think they're just going to run the ball some more, and continue to run the ball some more, and try to stay out of those negative leverage situations. This offensive line for the Hawkeyes is quite good. Minnesota's run defense this year has not been great when they've faced competent rushing attacks. So I would expect Iowa to try to just physically pound them up front and not ask Gronowski to throw the ball 20 or 25 times in this game. And we'll see if that can work.
It's funny. Like, there was a lot made of Tim Lester coming in as the offensive coordinator last year, and we were talking about how now that Brian Ferentz is finally gone, Tim Lester is going to come in and he's going to modernize this Iowa offense. They're going to use motion. They're going to be throwing the ball. They're going to be doing all of this stuff. And now here we are in year 2. And they're basically an option offense because Mark Gronowski has been a better runner than a passer. They are running the ball over 60% of the time, even in neutral down situations. This is not a team that is looking to drop back and throw the ball. As Bud was saying, they kind of want to just ground and pound you in the run game, and they've been very effective doing so. Like, they are not an overly explosive offense. They are not going to put up 45 points. The 37 they put up against Wisconsin, Chip, you said it. It doesn't count. Wisconsin is a dead football team walking. I'm throwing all the results from that game out of the window. This is going to be a more difficult test, but from what we have seen from this offense, I think they are going to be capable of doing it, and being at home will allow them to do so because, as Bud mentioned too, this defense has done a very good job against Minnesota because Phil Parker basically faces this offense every single day in practice. He knows pretty well what Minnesota's trying to do. But overall, like, we were expressing concerns about the Iowa defense early in the year because they just did not look as good as we were typically used to them seeing, particularly in the secondary. Well, they figured it out. In the last 4 weeks, going back to that Indiana game, you could argue nobody's done a better job slowing down the Indiana offense to this point than Iowa did. And from that point on, they have been playing very well. They are not giving up explosives. The secondary has looked much better in coverage. And I think that as this season goes along, maybe that defense continues to improve, and maybe suddenly Iowa's a team we kind of gave up on early in the year, who at the end of the season is one of the better teams in the Big Ten. So I like them in this matchup. I do think at home with that beautiful bronze pig on the line, Iowa's going to have a pretty strong performance, and it's going to be a tough test for the Gophers to go in there and get a win.
All right, let's dig in on that there, because this is, to your point, these are two teams that are 3-1 in Big Ten play. You know, we were picking all these other teams who could end up being the fourth college football playoff team. The winner of this game could finish higher than multiple of those teams, at least in terms of the Big Ten standings. Tom, if you were to set sort of a win total live line for the Iowa Hawkeyes? You mentioned that you like them in this game right here. Are we looking up, and this is a 9-3 team at the end of the year? What is the Iowa outlook? Because to your point, the beginning of the season, if you told me that this was going to be 9-3 by the end, I did not think that that's what the early returns were suggesting. That would be a very remarkable job by Kirk Ferentz in just another year of Iowa football. How do you see this season playing out for the Hawkeyes?
I mean, I'm not going to rule out 9-3 because I do think that they win this weekend, and I do think that they are a better team than we thought. It's just when you look at the schedule, they've got to play Oregon and USC still, and both of those Oregon's coming to Iowa City. They're going on the road for USC, and just traditionally what we have seen from Iowa is when they get in games against teams that are going to force you to actually score points to beat them, they struggle. So it's hard for me to imagine that they're going to beat Oregon and that they're going to go on the road and beat USC. I think 8-4 is far more likely of an outcome for this Hawkeyes team, which is a typical Iowa season in the end.
But tell you what, though, if Iowa had not dropped that early season game to Iowa State, we would have been talking about them in the first segment today, because like with Penn State, falling apart, you got to think Iowa could probably fare okay against Nebraska, just given Nebraska's line of scrimmage limitations this year. And we would be saying, hey, if you can get past Minnesota, all you got to do is get a split hosting Oregon or going at USC, which is certainly not easy. But like 10-2 Iowa, would have been in the playoff. That loss by 3 points to Iowa State early in the year, that kind of put a real damper on their playoff hopes. And obviously, I don't think any of us really believe that they're going to make the playoff at this point. But if they run the table, they're in. I think like 10-2 Iowa, given the difficulty of this schedule, they would be in. 9-3 is possible, not probable. I tend to agree with Tom. 8-4 is probably the most likely scenario, but they could certainly finish ranked.
Yeah, and there's also the matter of, are you going to start to be a thorn in the Big Ten title picture Like, is that going to happen if they were to hand Oregon a loss? Certainly interesting things to follow. PJ Fleck, no doubt taking notes that we have slided him. PJ, thank you so much for watching CBS Sports Network. We look forward to hearing from you on the Cover 3 podcast soon. And